Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the ancient Near East and the Fertile Crescent. We, at this point, are talking about some of the cool technological advances and innovations that the folks made who lived here, without which life as we know it would not exist. Today, in this video, for example, we are going to be talking about the concept of writing. That's right, the people who lived in the ancient Near East were the first ones to imagine that you can take ideas that we represent using words, and you can represent those words visually, so you can communicate without speaking. So what might that look like? Well, a very early way of writing things down is by using pictograms. This is how a lot of writing systems tend to start out, using pictograms. So let me give you an example of what a pictogram might look like. Ta-da! Turns out emojis are totally pictograms. So basically pictograms are just pictorial representations of a concept that I want you to know about, that becomes sort of consistent, right? So, you know, the little teary guy always looks the same, the little baby always looks the same. But basically, you should be able to look at this and figure out the story that I want to tell you. Like, there's a dude, he's sad, he meets a lady, they fall in love, they have a baby, and yay, now they're a happy family. You don't have to be able to speak English in order to figure out what I'm trying to tell you at this point, because these symbols represent concepts. But eventually, as a civilization keeps using a pictographic system, these symbols become a little bit more abstract. So you might come to a point where this symbol no longer represents the general concept of dude, but it just stands for the specific word man. So we only use this symbol when we want to use the word man. Later on down the road, it might start to represent the sound man and become divorced from the concept that you originally had in mind. So if we wanted to write the word manhole, we might start that word with this symbol, because now this symbol represents the sound man. And so that's kind of how it works. If you think of ancient Egypt, perhaps one of the first images that will pop into your head is something that looks a bit like this. Ta-da! This is an example of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. So this is their pictographic writing system, and you can see we've got pictures. These would have started off representing specific concepts, but eventually they come to represent sounds. Each of these represents a syllable, like ha or ra or something like this. So you string a bunch of these symbols together, and it's going to give you a word in ancient Egyptian. At this point, you really need to be able to speak ancient Egyptian in order to know what this writing means, because these symbols are going to give you a series of sounds, and those sounds aren't going to make any sense unless you speak ancient Egyptian. This is the point at which linguists really feel like you've got a fully fledged writing system, and you're not just sort of drawing little pictures of what you're talking about. So, the ancient Egyptians really loved their hieroglyphs. They stuck with this system of writing for a really long time. Things progress a little bit differently in Mesopotamia, though. They start off with pictograms as well, as writing systems are wont to do. But then eventually they're going to develop a system of writing called cuneiform. So we've got a civilization that existed in the area of Mesopotamia right here called Sumer, and the Sumerians are the ones that came up with this system of writing. So the Sumerians may have started out with, in fact they did start out with, a pictogram that looked something like this, right? You've got a little dude there. And then over time, the way that that's written is going to change. So that eventually you get a symbol that's a lot more abstract, but also a lot quicker and easier to write than this pretty picture of a head. But you can still kind of see where it comes from, right? Like this is the tip of the guy's head, this is the guy's nose, this is the guy's eye, you can see his rectangular neck. So you can see how the symbols become more and more abstract. Now, at this point, what the Sumerians were doing was they were sort of carving their symbols into wet clay tablets using a stylus. And a stylus is basically a pen with no ink. It's a long stick with a round tip, much like the stylus that I'm currently using to glide over my iPad. Of course, they didn't have iPads, but you get the idea. So eventually they figured out that they could make styluses much more quickly and easily. It turns out that this area around the Tigris and Euphrates, the marshlands around here, are chock full of these reeds. And if you cut the reeds down, it's a really quick and easy stylus. The thing is, these reeds have got a triangular cross section, so when you cut them down, they look kind of like this. And so when you take this stronger, sturdier, thicker end and you press it into a clay tablet, what you get is a wedge shape that kind of looks like this, which is not super helpful when you're used to drawing pretty little pictures, but they develop a sort of a quick approximation of their symbols, which develops into cuneiform, and cuneiform looks like this. So you can kind of see how they got there using these wedge-shaped styluses, right? Like this is sort of the triangular head with the eye, this is the rectangular neck. And so once they develop this quick way of writing using cheap and easy to make styluses, writing just explodes, and you see all kinds of examples from ancient Mesopotamia. I mean, they wrote down the things that they bought and sold and traded. They wrote down their laws, so we have an idea of how their government works. They wrote down literature. You can read the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written in this sort of cuneiform, and get an idea of what kinds of stories they thought were cool, and also, what traits they thought were important in a hero or a king, how their religion worked, all kinds of cool stuff. So the Mesopotamians really started, we see examples of their writing starting at around 3500 BCE, right? So that's 3,500 years before the year 0. Which is a little bit before we start seeing examples of writing in Egypt. So for that reason, although there are some historians that believe that the Egyptians came up with the idea of writing on their own, there are a lot of historians think that the Egyptians got the idea from the Mesopotamians through a process called cultural diffusion. And what that means basically is that some Egyptian guys went over to Mesopotamia to trade. They heard about this cool idea called writing, and they brought it back to Egypt. So cultural diffusion is people taking bits of one culture back and adopting it as their own. So Egypt may have gotten the idea of writing through cultural diffusion rather than just coming up with the idea all on their own. Okay, now, what I'm about to say technically is beyond the scope of our look at the ancient Near East, but I would feel really bad if you left this video with the impression that the Mesopotamians were the only civilization in the world to come up with the idea of writing and that everyone else in the world got the idea from them. That's not true. For instance, we believe that a culture in ancient China during the Shang dynasty came up with their own system of writing that evolved into modern-day Chinese languages, and that writing looked like that. So you can kind of see we've got a pictographic thing here going on. Historians think that this developed in China around 1400 BCE, right? And they don't think that it was a product of cultural diffusion. They think that the Chinese came up with it on their own, because although the Chinese would eventually become famous traders and establish trade routes all over the continent, in the year 1400 BCE, we don't have any reason to believe that they were doing that yet. So we don't think they had anything to do with the Mesopotamians, so they couldn't have gotten the idea from them. They must have come up with it on their own. Likewise, over in Mesoamerica, you get writing developing there as well. And depending, scholars sort of disagree. This is what it looked like, but scholars disagree as to what culture got there first and when exactly it happened, but it may have happened as early as 500 or 600 BCE. And we're pretty sure that these Mesoamericans, the Olmecs or the Zapotecs, depending on who you're talking to, we're pretty sure that they didn't get this idea from the Mesopotamians, because these guys did not have the kind of boats that you'd need to make contact. So they were clearly not hanging out with the Mesopotamians. They definitely didn't get the idea from them. But I just want you to know that it's lots of different civilizations all over the world were brilliant enough to come up with the idea of writing on their own. It's just that the Mesopotamians happened to be first out of the gate.